I grew up in California, started researching fossil marine mammals and associated sharks and bony fish and seabirds from relatively young deposits along the California coast. And did my master's at Montana State University, where I specialized in fossil preservation. I did my PhD at the University of Otago on early baleen whales. And then since 2015, I've been teaching and doing research here as part of a research fellowship at the College of Charleston and the Mace Brown Museum of Natural History, mostly researching 23 to 30 million year old fossil cetaceans representing the earliest known baleen whales and echolocated dolphins.
So what did eventually get you into sharks, or at least got you onto, I know that there was the Megalodon paper last year, I want to say, that was on their extinction. What kind of got you into that part of the field?
Sharks are actually what got me into marine mammals. I vividly remember growing up as a kid and being really disappointed that in the San Francisco Bay Area, there wasn't much in the way of dinosaur fossils or even dinosaur fossils on exhibit in any museums in Northern California. No, not really any local fossil sites. There are some fossil dinosaurs from the state and some really great marine reptiles, but all the dinosaur specimens are generally pretty poorly preserved, quite fragmentary, scattered. And it wasn't until high school I realized that there were non-dinosaur vertebrate fossils that were really interesting. So I started, and I was actually kind of mad that I didn't know that earlier. But my freshman year of high school, maybe sophomore year, I started going to various fossil sites, including Sharktooth Hill in Southern California and the Santa Margarita Sandstone in Scotts Valley near Santa Cruz, and started screening for shark teeth. And everybody seemed to know what all the shark tooths, all the different species of sharks were based on their tooth shape. This is such and such mako, this is a bit of a megalodon tooth, so on and so forth. But then somebody pulled out on my very first day in Santa Cruz, somebody pulled out this white molar. And like, I think it's a sea cow. And I was like, oh, cool. What's the species? They're like, I don't know. And I thought, well, that's weird that nobody knows what the marine mammal fossils are, but everybody knows what the sharks are. So I thought, that's a problem. And the more I read into it, there are these extensive marine mammal fossil collections from the West Coast that are basically unstudied. And it's been getting better in the last few years. But basically there were several researchers who basically just slowed down research on the West Coast marine mammal fossil record. And they've largely now retired. And that has, the influx of new blood into marine mammal paleontology on the West Coast has started chipping away at this massive backlog of research. But so I've always been interested in sharks. I generally don't find them as compelling scientifically as marine mammals. There's a lot less to do, but there's still some interesting questions, like the whole question of megalodon extinction that we delved into a few years ago.
My wife was asking if there's any shark coprolites that have been found. Is that a thing that exists in the fossil record, or do sharks not really produce preservable waste?
There is a large body of literature on shark and ray coprolites. There is a debate, and I haven't followed it as closely as I should, given my background as a taphonomist or person interested in fossil preservation. There is a debate going on whether or not the fossils are truly extruded waste or feces preserved in the large intestine at the time of death. They are one of the ways you can identify a shark coprolite is their spiral shape. And sharks have this thing called the spiral valve, and their large intestine is literally a corkscrew. And I've, cut them open, you can see it. And there are paleontologists out there who have made the claim that, well, once it gets extruded out, it loses the spiral shape. And therefore, when you find spiral-shaped coprolites, they actually represent feces fossilized right at the time of death while it was still in the animal. And I mean, I could buy that, but I would also expect maybe associated tooth sets to be more common. I don't know. There are a lot of fossil coprolites that have been found. They're not uncommon. There are entire bone beds in the fossil record of the UK where most of the fossils in the bone bed are not actually bones, but coprolites. They're actually called, such and such coprolite bed. People go there to just collect coprolites. I've found a lot here in South Carolina. They're quite common here. Although ours are mostly what are called scroll coprolites, and they are extruded kind of like a pancake rolled up and then kind of flattened. And they're thought to be produced by skates and rays. And they're super common in the Oligocene of the southeastern US. So I have no opinion really on whether or not they represent feces, squeezed out turd or still internal.
That actually is a really interesting answer. I didn't think there were any because, like, it's one of those things where I'm like, there's so much ocean water. Like, how much of it is really going to be preserved? So no, that's really cool.
And you would think that something like that might dissipate. If you ever, and I understand not everybody has had some of the experiences I have, but I have, or paid attention to animals swimming while they've taken a dump. But a lot of animals, when they take a dump underwater, it does sort of disintegrate and just spread all over the place. Parrotfish famously poop out coral sand. So most of the beautiful sand you're walking at on a tropical beach probably pass through the butthole of a parrotfish. I have, the mind of a 12-year-old and am, interested in fossil preservation as well. So I tend to, just pay attention to when animals poop. One of the things that's interesting about coprolites is their chemical composition, especially for vertebrate coprolites. If they're eating other vertebrates, their feces is rich in phosphorus. If you eat plants, not really much phosphorus there. It's mostly going to be carbon. Phosphorus, though, is in most animal life, and it is really important from a preservational standpoint because it is the element that makes our skeleton different from a clam or most invertebrates. Calcium phosphate has a very high preservation potential. And if you eat something that, if you're a hyena and you eat a gazelle, there's going to be bone fragments in your poo. Well, guess what happens underground if you deposit a coprolite or if you deposit feces that has calcium phosphate in it? It attracts more calcium phosphate. And if you do that enough, or if you have enough calcium phosphate rich coprolites, some of them are going to attract more calcium or more phosphate, or more phosphorus, I should say, or calcium phosphate, and result in the mineralization of the fecal mass. This can happen quite quick. There have been experiments that have been done where it can happen in a matter of weeks without burial. And it's not too dissimilar from some of the unusual processes that can result in the rapid fossilization of things like shrimp and crabs in soft bottom environments. So the fossil record does have a lot of fossil poo, but they are by far and away dominated by the feces of predators, which are numerically, on land anyway, far less common than herbivores. And that's because they have a different mineral composition and a much higher preservation potential than herbivore poo. In the marine realm, it's a lot different. There are, there's a much higher proportion of the biosphere that are consumers, at least within, vertebrates. Things that eat clams, sometimes their feces will get cemented. But there are a bunch of different preservational processes that work in parallel that make predator feces, and particularly sharks and fish, really common in the marine fossil record.
I mean, and that does make sense because it's one of those things where you do think more about like at least for me learning about coprolites in the past, it's like, oh yeah, here's like some crocodile ones, here's this, but you never hear like, oh yeah, this is a cow pie, right? So that was really interesting actually. That was great. What's some of the nursery type stuff for some of the megalodon stuff?
All we can say about that is yes, there are nursery areas for Carcharodonticles megalodon. Nursery areas are today used by modern sharks basically as relatively protected, predator-free shallow embayments with lots of fish where shark pups can grow to a larger size before venturing into the open ocean. So there's not a whole lot of baby sharks way out in the pelagic environment. Most of them are going to be in these shallow marine embayments. So for example, here on the South Carolina coast, we got Bulls Bay, which is only about a half-hour drive northeast here of Charleston. And there are 3 or 4 different sharks. I think bull sharks, some kind of hammerhead, maybe, oh God, I forget the common name, but a species of Rhizoprionodon. Several different sharks use some of the shallow embayments along the South Carolina coast as a nursery before they, go out into the open ocean. We just published a paper on the ancestor of Megalodon, Carcharodonticles angustidens, from the Oligocene epoch, so roughly about 25 million years ago. 2 different fossil sites with unbiased samples of shark teeth where the samples are dominated by juvenile teeth. Most of the individuals are 1/3 to maybe 1/2 full size. If you look at each tooth, reconstruct the body length from each tooth position, and then put them all on a histogram and graph them, we even ended up with a normal distribution, indicating it's probably a natural population, which is, I never really expected to get that. Vertebrate paleontologists generally don't have great sample sizes. So they've been using, sharks in general have been using the South Carolina coast as a nursery for tens of millions of years. There are megalodon nurseries, at least in the first one that was described was in Panama. And then there were a bunch analyzed in a paper that just came out last year by, well, I actually can't remember the name of the first author, but I think a student of Catalina Pimiento, and they analyzed at least like 5 or 6 different localities and interpreted at least 3/4 of them as being nurseries. And they're quite geographically scattered. So generally what you need, shallow environment, usually warm is good, lots of prey items and few predators. And in the fossil record, you might just be stuck with interpreting body length from these, large samples of teeth. And if they're all juveniles, or most of them are juveniles, then it's probably a paleo nursery. And there are non-nursery assemblages where most of the teeth are adults. So it's not just some weird aspect of fossil preservation where, and these are shed teeth anyway. So it's not like you have the same thing with mammal fossils or dinosaurs where, oh, we're finding a bunch of juveniles. Well, it's because juveniles have a higher mortality rate. These are shed teeth. Very few represent the dead individual at the time of tooth loss. So they are representing that animal at that size at a particular point in time that has, 99% chance of growing larger. Whereas you find like a bird skull or a mammal tooth, and it's an adult tooth, that animal croaked.
So you were talking about your site where you got all those teeth from, and you said there wasn't any bias. Can you describe what that means, just so?
There are a lot of fossil collectors here in South Carolina. More, 10 times, conservatively estimating, 10, possibly 30 times as many fossil collectors per area, population, however you want to compare it, versus where I grew up in California. And that's because fossils are hundreds of times more common here on the East Coast. there are shark teeth everywhere here. You can go out on most beaches and find them. Virtually every stream bed, construction site, and ditch and other random hole in the ground is going to have shark teeth and whalebone fragments coming out of it. In the, not in Charleston proper, but some of the outlying areas that are a little bit further inland, where the rocks are a little shallower, and the right rocks anyway are closer to ground level. Like where I live in North Charleston, anytime there's a hole in the ground that's dug more than about 10 feet deep, I go and I take a peek because it's probably going to be a whale or dolphin skull in the bottom. I collected a 30 million year old dolphin skull like 2 miles away from my house a couple summers ago, and a lot of megalodon teeth in the rocks just above it. So when you have that sort of competition with other collectors, if you're sharing a site, you're only getting part of the fossil assemblage. Some collectors keep everything, some don't. So if you have a fossil site that you're sharing, you might have an artificially biased assemblage because somebody beat you to it and kept all the big teeth. So in this case, we had one fossil site that was dug in the 70s systematically with a grid on private property. Every fossil was kept, and it was done by paleontologists at Charleston Museum, which is our partner institution a few blocks away. In 2018, our museum, the Mace Brown Museum, had exclusive access to a construction site about 3 miles away from our house, which also was helpful because we could go there any time of day we wanted. Sometimes we eat dinner and head over there for an hour after dinner, hunting right before sunset. And we collected everything, all the teeth. And again, there were no collectors biasing the sample. And I know that because there were loads of teeth out, big ones, some not really big ones, but medium-sized ones, which were the largest in our sample, and lots of little ones. And they were in good shape. These were ones that any collector would have picked up. And also the property owner wasn't letting anybody on, aside from us. So that's what I meant by unbiased.
So also going back to that with, you said Augustidens? Okay. And even Megalodon. So how, you're saying they're 1/3 to 1/2 full size. So how big would that be with that other species of Carcharocles or otodontids, depending on which one you want to use? And then how big would like the juvenile Megalodons be as well?
I'd have to double check about C. Megalodon, but for C. Angustidens, we took the body size cutoffs from the 2010 paper by Catalina Pimiento, and we adjusted them based upon the smaller maximum body size of Carcharocles angustidens. So the largest known Carcharocles angustidens specimens would have maxed out at about 11 to 12 meters, which is not as big as like the 17 to 18 meter long Carcharocles megalodon estimates, but it's still objectively a horrifyingly large shark. And that's like a 30 to 34 foot long shark as an adult. So our juvenile to adult cutoff, I think, was about roughly 6 meters, and I think 2.5 meters between neonate and juvenile. So a neonate is like a pup. So most of our sharks were about 3 to 4 meters in length. Maybe there were a handful that were over 5, and there were about, I think, like just 2 individuals that were true adults between 9 and 10 meters long.
Okay, so that is a really good spread of sizes then.
Yeah.
So there's been some discussion about what genus Megalodon does belong in, but like how long back does that lineage actually go though for the megatoothed sharks?
So one of the earliest known ododontid sharks, if you're talking about the entire family or clade, is Cretalamna. And Cretalamna, as is suggested by the genus name, goes back to the Cretaceous. Cretalamna has like a Cretaceous through Eocene fossil record. It's one of the larger sharks that sails on through the late Cretaceous extinction and survives. During the Paleocene, Cretalamna gives rise to the first experiment with serrated teeth, which was Paleocarcharodon orientalis, and that's quite a fairly rare shark that I think dies off by the end of the Paleocene. But it also gives rise to Otodus obliquus, which lives mostly in the Paleocene and early Eocene. And Otodus obliquus evolved into Carcharocles auriculatus, which is the first serrated species in the lineage during the middle Eocene. And then auriculatus begat Angustodons, Angustodons begat Chipotensis, Chipotensis begat Megalodon, and then the lineage ends.
So yeah, they really just like started, as soon as that Cretaceous hit, they really just started bulking up, it seems like.
Yeah, and the real obvious connection, I think, in a macroevolutionary perspective, is the loss of mosasaurs and plesiosaurs. Once you lose those marine reptile apex predators, sharks get truly gigantic for the first time within, 5 or 6 million years of the extinction.
And then you start getting some of those early whales and stuff too, right?
Not until the middle Eocene.
Okay.
So sharks enjoy about 10 million years of being the apex predators until Basilosaurus evolves. And then when that happens, the megatooth sharks develop serrations. They start eating some of the early whales and sea cows and get larger and larger and larger as marine mammal diversity increases.
With a lot of your study animals being mammals, I did have the question, and now that I know that you got into sharks originally, it may not be as pertinent a question, but do you have anything against Megalodon and the other large sharks for eating your study organisms?
No. It's like the meme from Godzilla, let them fight.